planes and, of course, the ships that we are lacking. This is also a comment about why we care about these things, and it is to restore self-governance. And obviously, as the Wall Street Journal has already reported this morning about the product that we have released today, it is about hard power. It is about the number of ships and planes we have. It's also about personnel. And we're having a very hard time, as some of our scholars have reported, in recruitment because of the woke agenda that one particular political movement in this country prioritizes over American military readiness. There is no way, as our scholars report, as you will hear today, that the United States can engage in a two-front war. And in fact, we're increasingly dubious that we could even engage in a single-front war because of this lack of readiness. Considering the existential threat in the world, which is the Chinese Communist Party, obviously rejuvenated after Xi Jinping's re-election on Sunday, the United States needs to get busy in fixing this problem. We're going to do so, of course, and we're going to do so not just by saying this is a blank check to spend on whatever the heck we want to spend, as long as you put military in it. Note that that's a warning from Heritage, not just to think that this is a blank check, but to spend, as we outline in our budget blueprint, on the right things for American military readiness to protect self-governance of free people around the world. The one person in Congress you could find who is so eloquent about this happens to be with us today. Congressman Mike Gallagher is, in fact, the man of the hour. He served Wisconsin's 8th Congressional District since 2017, 7 years prior in the U.S. Marine Corps, including 2 deployments to Iraq. He served on the Central Command Assessment Team in the Middle East and has worked with multiple agencies within the intelligence community. Congressman Gallagher serves on the House Armed Services Committee, the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. From 2019 to 2021, he served as co-chair of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, which develops strategic approaches to defense against evolving cyber threats to the United States. One logistical note, after Congressman Gallagher's remarks, we'll have a conversation with the editor of the Index, Dakota Wood, and our Executive Vice President, Derek Morgan. You will, of course, have opportunities to ask questions. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Gallagher.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and thank you to the Heritage Foundation for inviting me here today, and congratulations on the publication of the 2023 Index of Military Strength, which is an incredible accomplishment. Dakota and the entire team here, you should be very proud. Although I have to say that I don't know what was more depressing. Watching my Green Bay Packers lose to the New York Jets, which I didn't even know was a professional football team until I was there on Sunday, or reading this year's military index, which for the first time in the history of the Heritage Index downgrades the overall rating of the U.S. military. It's now weak. Reading the index, I thought to myself, you know, it sure would be nice if we didn't have to spend all this money on military strength in pursuit of peace. But here's the problem. We've tried everything else, and none of it seems to work. For example, at the height of utopianism that characterized the interwar period, the Senate actually attempted to outlaw war by ratifying the Kellogg-Briand Pact on January 16th, 1929. The only no vote was actually Wisconsin Senator John Blaine, who, as the author of the 21st Amendment, must have understood that outlawing war would work about as well as outlawing alcohol. Blaine subsequently lost his Senate seat. He was censured by the Wisconsin state legislature for his vote, while Secretary Kellogg won the Nobel Peace Prize. But just a few years later, signatories, including Japan, Germany, Austria, Italy, violated the treaty, eventually leading to World War II. In fact, today, war remains outlawed, and yet war persists. Because these same utopian delusions persist. Consider President Biden at the UN last fall, wish casting that we were closing an era of relentless war, an opening one of relentless diplomacy, in which, quote, many of our greatest concerns cannot be solved or even addressed by the force of arms. Or days before Vladimir Putin's latest invasion of Ukraine, Biden's special presidential envoy for climate, John Kerry, expressing his confusion about the looming invasion, saying, I thought we lived in a world that had said no to that kind of activity. Meanwhile, senior State Department officials projected their enlightened sensibilities onto Putin, scolding him that instead of invading Ukraine, he should focus on building back better. Or consider the Biden administration's national defense strategy, the cornerstone of which is a concept called integrated deterrence. Beneath the jargon, the basic idea is that we can de-emphasize hard power, yet still bolster deterrence by better integrating soft power, allies, and technology into military operations. But here's the issue. While the Pentagon is talking about doing less, the rest of the interagency is not talking about doing more. If you examine the strategic plans released this year by the Departments of State, Treasury, Commerce, the term integrated deterrence is nowhere to be found. Thus, it fails on its own terms. Yet, the administration has gone farther, deluding itself into thinking that integrated deterrence succeeded in Ukraine. Barely 1 month into the war, anonymous Pentagon officials bravely bragged to the Washington Post that integrated deterrence comes out smelling pretty good from this. Yet tens of thousands of dead Ukrainians, millions more displaced, should not smell, look, or feel good. A Post profile lauding Austin's application of integrated deterrence in Ukraine included Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Colin Kahl boasting that, quote, we are literally defying the laws of bureaucratic physics by how fast we're going in Ukraine. Now, I'm a Marine, not a physicist, but Newton's first law of motion states that an object in motion will stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force. And on February 24th, 2022, deterrence failed in Ukraine because, as Putin put his invasion plans into motion, President Biden repeatedly signaled that he would not put American hard power in Putin's way. The president preemptively pulled American troops out of Ukraine, abandoned our embassy, sent our ships sailing out of the Black Sea, even seemed to greenlight a minor incursion. The administration went so far as to limit the pre-war transfer of defense equipment out of a fear that it might provoke Putin. Instead, the Biden administration largely relied on the threat of sanctions and sternly worded statements to deter Putin, and deterrence disintegrated at the cost of tens of thousands of lives, hundreds of billions of dollars, and increasing threats of nuclear escalation. Eventually, after we went back and forth on the House Armed Services Committee, in a hearing, Secretary Austin and Chairman Milley actually admitted that integrated deterrence failed in Ukraine, and that, quote, short of the commitment of U.S. military forces into Ukraine proper, Putin was not deterrable. This was an important, if inadvertent, admission about the supremacy of hard power in matters of deterrence, one that has profound implications for how we deter a war with China over Taiwan. For when it comes to Taiwan, time is not on our side. We have entered the window of maximum danger, or the Davidson window, which is a reference to former Indo-Pacific Commander Phil Davidson's assessment that China may make a move on Taiwan within the next 5 years. Divesting of hard power within the Davidson window is dangerous. And yet the Biden administration insists on doing just that. The Biden defense budget would force the Navy to bottom out at 280 ships and the Air Force to cut over 1,000 airplanes by 2027, just in time for the PLA's 100th anniversary and target date for having the capability to take Taiwan. Most of the transformative technology that DoD is investing in with its much hyped 9.5% increase in the research and development budget, from hypersonic weapons to Joint All-Domain Command and Control, or JADC2, may not be fielded until the 2030s, if at all. Making matters worse, we are running low on the munitions that are essential to both Ukraine and Taiwan. 2 months into the war, we had already sent Ukraine a quarter of our entire Stinger stockpile and more than 7 years worth of Javelins. Now, admittedly, some people think I'm too pessimistic and think that the 69-year-old Xi Jinping, who this week is securing a third term as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, will abandon his lifelong ambition of taking Taiwan. But look at what he's just recently gotten away with. Hong Kong, genocide, covering up a coronavirus pandemic that's killed at least 6 million people globally. Furthermore, Xi's problems, structural economic slowdown, skyrocketing household debt, the demographic buzzsaw of dealing with more retirees than any society in human history, all get worse in the 2030s. Why would he wait? We must not gamble the fate of the free world on Xi's restraint, nor on our own utopian delusions that somehow we've evolved beyond wars of territorial expansion. We must put American hard power in Xi's path before it's too late. While long-term investments to rebuild American military superiority in general and maritime superiority in particular are critical, the reality is we will not be able to build the Navy the nation needs in the next 5 years. But what we can do within the Davidson window, however, is build an anti-Navy. And by anti-Navy, I mean asymmetric forces and weapons designed to target the Chinese Navy, deny control of the seas surrounding Taiwan, and prevent PLA amphibious forces from gaining a lodgment on the island. The first step in building this anti-Navy does not actually require us to defy any laws of physics, bureaucratic or otherwise, though technically it is rocket science. Now that we are no longer bound by the INF Treaty, we can surge long-range conventional precision fires in 3 concentric rings across the Pacific: the first island chain, the second island chain plus the Central Pacific Islands, and the outer edges of the theater, including Alaska, Hawaii, and Australia. In the first ring, we need shorter range anti-ship and air defense missiles, such as the Naval Strike Missile, long-range anti-ship missile, and SM-6. These weapons will be operated by Army and Marine Corps stand-in forces, especially in the southern Japanese and northern Philippine islands, and wherever possible, they should be containerized so as to confuse Chinese targeting. In the second ring, we need extended range maritime strike tomahawks and other intermediate range missiles. And in the third ring, we need longer range intermediate missiles with advanced energetic materials in places like Alaska and Australia's Northern Territory. The point is that the PLA rocket force, which is China's anti-Navy, has fielded low-cost weapons to keep American ships out of the fight and target American forces concentrated in a few fixed locations. We must use this same logic against them, building an anti-Navy that can sink PLA ships and amphibious landing craft in port, in the Strait, and on Taiwan's beaches. The second step in building an anti-Navy is to stockpile munitions before the shooting starts. That's one of the big lessons of Ukraine. At current production rates, for example, it will take at least 2 years to boost Javelin production from 2,100 to 4,000 missiles annually. And in many cases, Chinese companies are the sole source or a primary supplier for the energetic materials that are used in our missiles. To fix this, the Pentagon should stop buying minimum sustaining rates of critical munitions and start maxing out the capacity of active production lines through multi-year procurement contracts. Drawing on the lessons of Operation Warp Speed, we can also modernize the Defense Production Act and use it to provide direct project financing, automatic fast tracking of permits, and investments in defense workforce training. Consider that when I first deployed to Iraq in 2007, most Marines were still riding around in highly vulnerable Humvees. And then when I returned in 2008, as if by magic, suddenly we all had MRAPs. But of course it wasn't magic. It was because Secretary Gates made fielding them his highest acquisition priority. The next Secretary of Defense must similarly make rebuilding our munitions industrial base a personal crusade. Now, the third and final step in building this anti-Navy is to turn all of the talk about arming Taiwan to the teeth into reality. This starts with moving Taiwan to the front of the foreign military sales line and clearing the backlog of $14 billion worth of FMS items that have been approved but not delivered to Taiwan. Congress can go even further by providing direct financial assistance to Taiwan and by giving the Pentagon the same drawdown authority to directly provide defense articles to Taiwan that it already enjoys with Ukraine. For example, rather than demilitarizing hundreds of Harpoon missiles or putting them into deep storage, the Pentagon could utilize a Taiwan drawdown authority and make any modernizations or necessary certifications and send these missiles, along with their associated launchers, to Taiwan. We should also learn from the first two Taiwan Strait crises, where President Eisenhower dramatically increased American combat power on and around the island. This means increasing the size and frequency of American active duty and National Guard rotations on Taiwan and giving them the tools they need to help put Chinese amphibious assault ships at the bottom of the Taiwan Strait. We can complete these steps within the Davidson window. In concert with the top-line increase, we can pay for it by reducing the size of DoD's civilian workforce, larger than the Army, the Joint Staff, the Office of Secretary of Defense, the overall number of flag and general officers, and the fast-growing DEI bureaucracy. We can recycle valuable assets that contribute nothing to warfighting, like golf courses. We can resurrect the 2015 Defense Business Board study of DoD's core business practices, which identified a path to saving $125 billion over 5 years, more than enough to build both the anti-Navy and the Navy the nation needs. In other words, we don't lack options, we lack leadership. We lack leadership in the Pentagon capable of bending the bureaucracy to their will in service of a defense strategy that prioritizes hard power. And we lack leadership in the White House that understands the paradox at the heart of deterrence, that to avoid war, you must convince your adversary that you are both capable and willing to wage war. If we ignore hard lessons about hard power, if we continue down this utopian path of disarmament, or if we allow the fear of escalation to dominate our decisions, we will feed Xi's appetite for conquest and we will invite war itself. By choosing instead to put an anti-Navy in Xi's path, we can deter war in the short term and buy time to build a Navy that defeats communism over the long term. Thank you, and I'm happy to entertain some questions.
If you could identify yourself and any organization that you're affiliated with, we'd really appreciate that. Yes, sir. You have a microphone?
Congressman, I'm Dr. Michael Krause. I'm a soldier no longer young. I recently celebrated at my family, I'll say 2 vignettes. One, I celebrated my 80th birthday, and I told my family of 8 grandsons and granddaughters that I was not doing a handoff very well. We're in for tough times. You give me the second vignette is now there is hope in the anti-Navy that you speak of. Now there is hope in doing the kinds of preparation. So my question to you, I've addressed Norwich University, MS4, future leaders, and I've been pretty hard on them. What can I tell my grandsons and granddaughters that gives us the kind of hope that you just articulated, and also the MS4 new lieutenants in the Army and also the Marine Corps? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your question. Thank you for your service. Though you may no longer be young, I'm told that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. A great Wisconsinite once said that, in fact. Or at least he got his commission to West Point from Wisconsin. I would say a few things. And I really am concerned. Something has happened in the last 6 years that or the last 2 years that I've never encountered in my time in Congress, which now I have parents coming up to me whose kids are considering going into the military enlisting or going to a service academy, and they're saying, you know, is this a good idea? And that's a new glitch in the matrix that is very, very troubling. So I would say, one, absolutely. I still think the best decision I ever made in my life was joining the United States Marine Corps. It's a phenomenal experience for every young men and women who want to serve this great country of ours. Absolutely do it. All the problems we have with perceived politicization of the military, I believe we can get those fixed. I believe we're going to have a very productive agenda if Republicans take control of the House, one that is squarely focused on warfighting and rebuilding our excellence and focus when it comes to matters of warfighting. I think you're going to see a change. I think the American people are going to support that change. The other thing I would say, though, is in my mind, all of this comes down to basic love of country. In other words, how do you convince young men and women to fight and die for a country that in some parts of the country we're teaching them is evil, or racist, or a neo-colonial hellscape that must constantly apologize for its past sins and be afraid of its shadows? In other words, we need to have confidence that our values are indeed superior to the values, if that term is even the right one, that the Chinese Communist Party is putting out there. And the final thing I'd say is, I believe we do face an existential threat from the Chinese Communist Party. And so we're going to need everybody, those that choose to serve, those that choose to go to the private sector. We need everybody to get on Team America, because we're not destined necessarily to win this competition. We have to work hard, not only to prevent World War III, but win the long-term competition. So please don't lose faith in the basic goodness of this country. It may not be perfect, but it happens to be the best experiment in self-government in human history. So let us not screw it up. Let us not be the generation that screws the whole thing up.
Shirt.
By the way, the hard questions go to Dakota's panel afterwards.
Hi, Pat Spann. I'm a 69 West Point grad, and at one of our class luncheons that we have quarterly in McLean, our rep at the Association of Graduates mentioned that 17 congressmen did not nominate any future cadets. And my question is that just a lack of interest in the young men or women, or is it something else in Congress? I can't believe seven, because each congressman, for people to know, each congressman, at least when I was there, was allowed to have 5 cadets in resident at one time. So usually you had 1 a year, and then 1 year you had 2, and if someone dropped out, you could replace them the following year. So I just was amazed that 17 congressmen did not nominate anybody.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for your service. I'm always indebted to Army officers. I don't know. This is my lot in life as a Marine. Without knowing the specifics of those 17 cases, quite honestly, it would shock me if the explanation were there wasn't interest within a congressional district of 750,000 people to have 5 or so young kids apply for the service academies. That would shock me. So I doubt that's it. And I don't know what the issue is. I just would say, notwithstanding some of the controversies we've had over curriculum at service academies and some of the back and forth we've had in the Armed Services Committee with Chairman Milley and others in the CNO, I would say the best part of my job is getting to nominate young kids to go to the service academies. And this kind of gets to your question too, sir. Something that should give you hope, I think, is the quality of young Americans that are applying. I mean, it's so competitive. I don't think I could get in if I were a high school kid applying today. And it's so powerful to see the parents' reaction too. I stole this idea from a colleague of mine, but I've used it for the last 6 years, that when we get a notification from the service academies before, a little bit ahead of when the family does, so I'll call the school and I'll tell the principal to get the kid out of class. And these kids are all, they have a spotless record. They've never been in trouble. So for the first time in their lives, they think they're getting suspended. So they sort of do the Charlie Brown walk to the principal's office. And then I'm on the phone or I'm there in person. And, I say, hey, Mike Gallagher, you don't know me. I'm your member of Congress. I just want to be the first to congratulate you on getting in to West Point or Naval Academy. And we're just so proud of your accomplishment and look forward to you serving this country. And a lot of times these kids will cry, the parents will cry. I had my tear ducts removed a few years ago in the Marine Corps, so I don't cry, but sometimes it gets a little dusty in the room. But it's such a great opportunity for kids that, I don't know, I have to look into those 17 cases. And if it's a matter of members of Congress not getting out there and promoting the opportunity, well, that's a dereliction of duty.
Yeah, hi, Congressman. I'm Mike Lynn with the Washington Times, and before everybody boos, I was also a soldier once and fought in Iraq myself.
Got any sailors, any Marines? Gosh. Rough.
I've written several stories in the paper about the problems with the military in the last couple of years. What I'm specifically interested in is what you and the GOP plan on doing, some specifics if you end up taking one or both houses up on Capitol Hill or next month.
Sure. Well, with the caveat that I don't speak for who will be the chairman of the committee, Mike Rogers, who's phenomenal, but I'll probably be a subcommittee chair. I think the North Star for all of our efforts has to be warfighting, as I alluded to in my speech. If you read Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1, Warfighting, it says the military has two purposes: to fight wars and train to fight wars, and anything that distracts from those two purposes is not worth taxpayer money. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what it says. That has to guide all of our efforts. So anything that does not contribute to our warfighting ability should not be funded. Now, I would go further and say some of the controversies we've had over the growing diversity, equity, and inclusion, bureaucracy in the military are a problem that we will address in the next Congress. And I do think we're going to need to rebalance our overall tooth-to-tail ratio. I identified some areas where we can start. I have amendments in this year's NDAA that at least require a study of the growing size of the Joint Staff, of OSD, et cetera, et cetera. Arnold Prunaro has a great book recently that talks about the way in which, our acquisition workforce is 175,000 people, almost the size of the Marine Corps. I mentioned the civilian workforce, which is 813,000, I think, at last count, larger than the size of the Army. So I do think those are areas where Republicans can be more responsible stewards of the taxpayer dollars. At the same time, we're arguing for a bigger increase in defense investment. But here's the other thing we need. And if we are in charge of the House, I can't speak for the Senate. They spend plenty of time speaking for themselves. We need it all to add up to a coherent strategy. What is our plan in simple terms, not in highly acronymed jargon or highly, bureaucratic language to defend Taiwan from a looming Chinese invasion? If the Pentagon can't articulate that, it's going to be hard for us who consider ourselves navalists or proponents of defense spending to make a case to our constituents that this is a sound investment of their money. We need to force them to articulate this in simple and direct language. So those are just a few ideas. I'm happy to elaborate more.
Congressman, I'm Harold Hagen, Major General, Norwegian Defense Attaché to the U.S. and Canada. Thank you very much for sharing your views and in this open audience. I'm curious about one thing. One of the big force multipliers that the U.S. has is France. I have 140 colleagues from different nations all around the world that brave themselves about, working with their most important and strongest ally. I would like to hear you elaborate a bit on working with allies and partners, which I think will be extremely important in the future as well, as we share the same values and eventually will fight the same fight.
So first of all, thank you for your country's friendship with ours and contributions to both of our security. It's very much appreciated, certainly appreciated, I think, in a bipartisan fashion on Capitol Hill. Maybe I'll just go quickly region by region. Let's start with Europe. I welcome some of the rhetoric we've seen from NATO members in general and Western European countries in particular, particularly the Germans, about rearming, about investing more in their defense, about contributing more to Ukraine. The fact is, the United States can't do all of this by ourselves. We need some of our European allies to step up. That's a positive development. And I'll go further and say, I think what Secretary Austin is trying to do with his routine process for coordinating with all of the members who have made promises is a good effort, and it deserves bipartisan support. But we need to make sure people actually deliver. And I think the fundamental problem we have in terms of our rhetoric surrounding NATO is that we, and I'm saying politicians, U.S. politicians, are obsessed with the inputs and not paying enough attention to the outputs. And by that, I mean, what's the thing you constantly hear when people criticize NATO? It's 2% of GDP, 2% of GDP. Well, that's important. I want every member to meet the 2% promise, but I'm in some ways more interested in what that 2% buys. And if it doesn't buy things that work together, if we don't have a coherent, integrated allied plan for defending the Baltic states against Russian aggression, then that money is wasted. We should also look for every opportunity to identify new partners who aren't former NATO allies, though we just got a couple more NATO allies, which is a good thing. I think the Ukrainians have proven how important it is and how powerful it is when you have friends that are willing to fight. And that, to me, for those who are concerned that we're overextended in the world and may want to retrench, well, maybe you can find efficiencies if you're willing to work by, with, and through allies and partners on the ground that can fight. That's the lesson I learned from my time in Iraq, and I think we saw that also play out in Syria, in some cases in Afghanistan. Moving to the Middle East, when it comes to allies and partners, my concern is this administration, much like the Obama administration before it, has gotten the basic alliance structure wrong. There's a historic level of cooperation underway between Israel and the Sunni Arab Gulf states. We've never seen this happen before. We should harness it. The Abraham Accords is the foundation for regional stability. Put differently, if you want us to do less in the Middle East, the only responsible way to reduce American force posture is by working more aggressively with that emerging alliance. And it's alliance built in opposition to Iran. Iran is the long pole in the tent, right? We made the mistake under multiple administrations of prioritizing Middle East peace when that was not a top 3 issue for our Sunni Arab allies. So we have an opportunity in the Middle East to build upon the Abraham Accords and bring in some countries into that framework, not only sort of the grand prize, which would be Saudi Arabia, but that are in other regions, Indonesia, for example, which leads me to the Indo-Pacific. Obviously, I've been a critic of integrated deterrence. I've written about it. I just spoke about it. But if we wanted to integrate diplomacy into military deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, well, what would we be doing? Well, at the top of the list, as I alluded to, we would be spending a lot more time and energy building our relationship with the Philippines and Japan, 2 treaty allies that we need basing agreements with. We would be spending, in a way where you can get a lot of bang for your buck, a lot of time in all these islands that we tend to neglect, right? We've seen this play out in the Solomon Islands, the dangers of taking your eye off that ball and allowing the Chinese to fill the vacuum. The compact states, why haven't we come up with an agreement with the compact states? That's low-hanging fruit in the Indo-Pacific. The head of, I think Vanuatu, or who was the head of Palau, was saying he's willing to host expanded U.S. military facilities and harden all of our infrastructure. There's so many opportunities across the Indo-Pacific. And the final thing I'd say is, I do think the heart of the free world is, and I don't mean this as an insult to anyone who's not in Five Eyes, but the fact is our Five Eyes partners are our closest allies. I salute the AUKUS agreement. I think that was a great achievement. I praised the Pentagon officials who are responsible for that. Here's the problem with AUKUS, and it gets to the main message I hope you take away from my speech. The promise of AUKUS is Australian nuclear subs that aren't going to be fielded until the mid to late 2030s. So that's good, but that doesn't solve our short-term problem. Why aren't we harnessing AUKUS in order to field technology in the next 2 years? I mentioned intermediate range missiles in Northern Australia. They could have sovereign control if they need it, but there are many ways where we can build upon our closest alliances. The other problem we have with AUKUS, with both the Brits and the Aussies, is we still have these arcane ITAR rules which prevent us from collaborating technologically. So that's just a long way of me saying, even in the alliances that we think are really healthy right now, there's so much more we can do to get more defense at less cost.
Well, Congressman, thank you very much for being here today. That was an excellent opening and speech and elucidation of the principles of keeping America strong. Please join me in welcoming and thanking.
Thank you.
Dakota Wood is going to join me up here on stage to discuss a little bit more in detail on the index of military strength in 2023. Dakota, we start here at Heritage. The first thing we talk about is the solid foundation of data and research. Can you just describe for a little bit how we came about to these conclusions we reached in the report? What kind of data are you looking at, and how do you build that foundation?
Well, so we want to publish, so we don't delve into any classified materials. All the things that we go to are open source, and that could be interviews, certainly congressional testimony, budget documents. If the Army wants to buy something, they've got to submit a request for that, right? So we spent a lot of time building on a quarter century, 36 years, some of our individuals that have prior military service and understanding of things, diving into those materials and then extracting from the public record the things that are relevant to hard military power. And so every comment that we make in the index, every figure that we cite, every assessment is linked to some source, something like 2,500 footnotes or whatever for the geeks in the crowd, where anybody can go to the same material that we went to and then decide for themselves, are we accurately portraying it or not, right? So we think that it's a wonderful compendium of information that anybody else would have to spend months accumulating if they knew where to go. We put all that together in one volume, and it's that data that undergirds all of the insights and the final assessments, the conclusions we come to.
Yeah, and that's we've got a long history at Heritage of doing that, of having, whether you agree with recommendations or not, you know where we found the data, you can go find it yourself. So that's wonderful to hear. Can you talk to us a little bit about this main headline that is coming out today, that we're regarding overall military strength as weak? How did we come to that conclusion, and what does that mean?
So it's alarming, and we didn't do that with a smile on our face at all. We have a range of very strong to very weak and gradations in between, and we specifically structured our methodology and our scoring so that they're big chunky things, right? I mean, how do you determine the difference between 70 and 71 on a 100-point scale, right? So things really have to be dramatic in the assessed year to cause us to either improve or decline in our assessment of the services. And we've just seen this trend over time that readiness is in the tank. Most of the equipment that the services use is just old. The average age of an Air Force fighter in the U.S. Air Force is 32 years old. Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles that are still sitting in silos were first acquired in the early 1970s, right? So these are just examples of the kinds of equipment that people were using. We specifically stated in there that this is not an indictment of a sailor, soldier, guardian, Marine, Coast Guardsman, whomever. We have wonderful people that are working extraordinary hours every week, repeated deployments, but what they're equipped with is stuff that was brought in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, you know? So if an aircraft off of a carrier or an air base flies a sortie of 2 or 3 hours, doesn't meet any opposition, doesn't drop a bomb, you're still using flight time on that airframe, right? And so over the last 20 years of sustained use, the services and their forces have just gotten progressively older. They're not being modernized or replaced, you know, in concert with that use. And so the military we have is just dramatically too small. The Navy is half the size it was during the Cold War. The Marine Corps and the Army, perhaps 2/3. The Air Force is short 650 pilots. So it's a numbers game. So what we did historically is see how much military power is actually used in a major war like Korea or Vietnam and Desert Storm. The United States would want to do that in more than one place at a time. So if we're going to commit to defense of NATO allies in Europe, does that mean that you can't cover down on Japan or the Philippines or providing support to Taiwan? So the ability to do two things in different parts of the world is really, really important. Our military is not up to that. And the readiness levels and the age of the equipment, the ability to fly and drive and shoot and train and all that stuff is just so low, we just had to lower the overall score for military power to that score of weak.
Well, you've given us several headlines there, and one of the ones that drew my attention in the report, which is excellent, is the flight hours in the Air Force. Can you explain why it is that we're not giving our young pilots the hours that they need in flight?
So it's a money issue and it's a perspective issue. So if you only drove your car once a week and everybody was saying that's all you really need, you think you're probably a pretty good driver. Until you get into a dicey situation, you're on a slippery road or heavy traffic or something like that, and then you find out that maybe once a week isn't enough. And so if you've got a driver who's driving 5 or 6 times a week, muscle memory, just a sense of what's going on. So for too many years, pilots have had this sense that flying just once or twice a week was good enough. And you supplement that with some study and maybe some simulator time, but you're good to go. Well, our operations in the last 20 years has been against terrorist groups and insurgents with no air power, no anti-air power, any kind of air defense sorts of systems. And so your ability to do things becomes normalized that you think what you're doing is good enough, right? So if we go back to the old days of the Cold War and you were actually flying against a competent, capable opponent, Air Force pilots would routinely fly 250, 300, more than 300 hours a year. Today, the average flight hours for an Air Force pilot across all type, model, series of aircraft is less than 120. And some of our most capable pilots in the most capable aircraft are down in the mid-70s. If you can imagine that, 74, 75 hours a year. So it's a funding thing. When you fund flight hours, cost and fuel and repair on the airplane is one aspect. But then there's this other aspect of, do I think I'm flying enough to be competent? Well, how do you measure competence? And so those things are really in question in that service, in particular in that area of flight hours. But we think we see echoes in other areas of military training in the other services.
Yeah, could you speak to the U.S. Navy? You've mentioned that the fleet is about half the size it was in the Cold War, but I think you've told me before that we have about the same number of ships out at any given time deployed. So what does that do to Navy morale and recruitment and retention and just overall readiness?
Well, like the Congressman, I'm a former Marine as well, so I try to keep things simple. If I have 2 cars at home and I'm running errands and I can use both, the wear and tear on a car is what it is. If I lose one of those vehicles and now I have to do everything with one, I have doubled the load on that. It's going to wear out faster, the tires wear out faster, those sorts of things, right? If I have fewer people making those deliveries, the time spent. So the same thing occurs with platforms, and Navy ships are a great example of this. If you were near 600 ships near the end of the Cold War, and you kept 100 deployed on average each day, and then today you have 292, I think I checked the numbers this morning, so half the number of ships, we still have 100 deployed every day. So each crew on those ships is working twice as hard. You're deploying the ships twice as often. Maintenance problems increase. You get into a shipyard, there are more things broken that I have to repair. The ship stays in for a longer period of time, so you can see how the backlog of maintenance of other ships waiting their turn, other crews waiting for their rest and to meet their families again, right? So when you have too few things, whether it's a plane or a ship, and they're still working at the same operational tempo, the system starts to break down.
Well, we're going to have time for audience questions in just a moment. I've got one more while you're thinking of your question. And that is, I remember when I worked for Vice President Cheney, he used to talk about the Defense Department that he inherited when he was Secretary of Defense, and that it wasn't something that was built in a day. It was because of the Reagan defense buildup all through the 80s that allowed us to have a decisive impact and win against Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait. And I think the military spending in the mid-'80s was over 5% of GDP, about 5.7%. Today we're at about 3%. Can you talk to us about what it's going to be necessary to do over a long period of time in order to get us prepared to fight another major war.
So my colleague Brent Sadler and I have friends in the submarine industry, and they will say that to train a welder to do the specific exotic welding that you would need to keep the submarine operational under the sea takes about 5 years. So if you wanted to expand production of a particular thing, you have to hire the workforce, you have to train them to a level of competency before you can even start delivering new materials to your force. The congressman had spoken about the munitions that we're providing to Ukraine in their war, trying to defend their own country against Russia. One of the companies that makes some of those missile items would say if you gave them a check today, they would have a replacement munition in 2 to 3 years. The Army dramatically shrank as one factor was sequestration, the dramatic cut in funding. You can cashier or deactivate an Army brigade overnight. It takes 2.5 to 3 years to rebuild that, to get the staff work in place so that it's again competent. So there is this time consideration where it takes years to build ships, it takes years to train units, it takes years to replace expended inventories of types of things. And if you're at minimum sustained rates, meaning that you have a minimal workforce and you're only producing just enough things to keep the company in business, if you want to expand that, there is a huge delay. So this idea of an insurance policy of deterrent value of your force, part of that is associated with the money that you put into the system, right, to keep your forces healthy, to keep them trained, and to have good modern equipment.
Yeah, and when we have a looming threat like China on the horizon, we have no excuse to not act today to build that army that we need for then. Okay, let's see. We have time for questions. Do we have any questions from the audience? We've got one in the back there. Wait for the microphone for the sake of our online and audience.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. I'm an intern here, Vincent Palomo, but I'll also be commissioning into the Army in December. And as said before, the nature of the military is kind of changing and in some ways pretty demoralizing. And a big part of that, as Gallagher said in his intro, but didn't really touch it in his speech, was the personnel. And a lot of great people leave the military because it is such a demoralizing and unrewarding place to be for success. And that kind of leaves people who we don't want to be leading our military in, but also the people who leave, they're smart and they know what they're doing, and they go to these defense companies and kind of perpetuate the never-ending cycle of development instead of actually creating a product that we can sustain, as seen by all these aircraft and new Navy ships that don't work, we don't know how to use, and are inoperable. So what is kind of the plan to better the personnel in our military and ensure that we have strong leaders that can win a war? Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you for interning here, and thank you for your future service. So what about recruiting? We note in the index that the Army has come up short of its recruiting goals. And so I wonder if you want to speak to that, and maybe Tom Spohr could chime in after that. I know he's been looking at this issue intently as well.
So a lot of layers to the comment and the question. Part of it is convincing people that it's worthwhile to join, retaining them over a period of time, and then when they leave, what do they do after that, right? So there's a lot of components to that. If you join the military to fly an airplane and you never get to fly an airplane, why would you want to stay in, right? When I came in the Marine Corps, I had a roommate who loved tanks, so he wanted to be a tank officer. If you don't go to the field and rehearse and practice and work on those things, then where's the motivation to stay in? So this high levels of training, challenging, making those days and hours worthwhile is one component of retaining your personnel. If the military is being painted with a bad brush, that it's broken, everybody who joins suffers from PTSD, that it's rife with all kinds of predators, and that's a lot of what we see conveyed in the literature and the media, which is completely inaccurate. Why would somebody want to join that? Since 1980 or so, the American population has grown from 220 million to 330 million. And yet our military, and I'll use the Army as an example, has shrunk from 770,000 active duty soldiers to 450,000. So you've got these two trend lines where more and more people have less and less access to a smaller and smaller military. So the individual person just doesn't have a reference point, right? So part of this, and Congressman Gallagher talked about it, is this need on a national level to have a discussion about the nobility and value and importance of military service, that we fund the military such that pilots can fly and ship drivers can drive their ships and tank guys can go to the field and shoot rounds. You know, there has to be a sense of worthwhileness for all of these sorts of things. And I think a lot of those things are off course. So having this kind of discussion and dialogue, you produce great citizens for the country that then go back out. They're more civic-minded. They're more involved in their own communities. So it's a virtuous cycle if you can kind of kickstart that again. And the Heritage Foundation has put together a national-level commission to look at this idea of recruiting and volunteer service specifically associated with the military. And General Sporer, who leads our Defense Center, will help to chair that. We've had members from Congress involved. And it's this idea of what are the obstacles to recruiting? How do we make serving in the military valued and seen as worthwhile? And we're looking forward to the results of that effort.
Anything you'd add to that, General Sporer? I know you gave an excellent speech at Hillsdale on recruiting.
Thank you. And Dakota really captured it. You know, when they talk about COVID, they talk about the people that are going to have the worst outcomes are the ones that have comorbidities. And so they're obese and they have this problem and they have that problem. And that's what's recruiting right now. It is a collection of comorbidities, if you will. And so the current labor market where unemployment is 3.5%, the lowest it has been in anyone's memory. The small number of Americans that can qualify for military service, only 23% of Americans can qualify to come in the military, mostly because of obesity, some because of drug use, some because of mental health issues. But then you combine that with the issues that Dakota talked about, just a decreasing propensity on the part of young Americans to serve in the military. And so we have to make the case to young Americans why they should serve. And the old arguments about college aid and things like that are not attracting young people nowadays. They're just not working. And so we can increase recruitment bonuses, enlistment bonuses. Money isn't touching this generation, and we have to think about this problem much more differently than we have in the past. And so I think that's the work that's cut out for all of us.
We look forward to the results of that commission. That'll be really helpful. We have more questions. I think we've got one here. Maybe have time for two more.
Hi, Lauren Fish, L3 Harris. What do y'all make of the seemingly growing disconnect between the urgency that we hear on Capitol Hill, including with Representative Gallagher, about the China challenge, the Davidson window? You know, clear senior leaders at DOD also expressing a time frame of 5 to 7 years of a Taiwan challenge. I've heard even sooner potentially from Capitol Hill leadership. And the lack of urgency, it seems, in the acquisition process. You know, if we're really looking at a 5-year time frame, why aren't we stockpiling the way Representative Gallagher indicated today? Why aren't we buying more F-35s, things that can run off the production line right now? We have about 2, maybe 3 POM cycles before 2027. So how are we actually, like, what do you make of that disconnect? Does DOD not really see the challenge, or is it just bureaucratic inefficiency?
Did you want to take that?
Well, Dakota, I'm going to hand over to you, but I think it's an excellent question. You note in the index that China is our biggest threat. It's a peer or near peer competitor, and that we have to be ready to deter them and, if necessary, fight them. So, how would you compare China versus Russia, and are we really ready if we act now, will we be ready to be able to confront and deter China?
We've got this great graphic. It's a map-based thing in the index, and it talks about NATO member countries spending, right? And what you find is the people or the countries that are closer to Russia approach their defense spending more seriously. And so those levels up, and the further away you are geographically, or the more distracted you are with more social spending at home, the lower those levels are. So the challenge with the United States is we're 7,000 miles away from China, big Pacific Ocean. How does it really affect Wisconsin or Florida or Missouri, right? In Russia, well, they seem to be handling it. One, they're performing fairly poorly. The Ukrainians are just doing extraordinary things, and we're giving them all this stuff. But how does that translate into having a ready squadron or brigade back here in the United States? So the whole idea is this proximity to risk and whether you believe bad things can really happen. You know, we maintain insurance on our cars because we all know that at some point, you're a great driver, so you'll not have to call of an accident, but somebody else will bump into you, and so you carry insurance. Well, the military is our national insurance policy, but nobody wants to go to war. Few people believe we'll ever actually be at war. Integrated deterrence, with diplomacy and economic, relationships will keep war from ever happening. So now you're a member of Congress. How do you make the case to your constituents that we need to increase defense spending? all politics are local. I'd rather have subsidized health care, subsidized education, subsidized whatever it might be, right? So all of this spending that occurs in Washington, D.C. goes to a lot of domestic issues. And if you want to put a dollar against defense, you're saying we actually might have to go to war. This would be the opponent. This would be the level of severity. And it's hard to really put data to that, to say that by 2027, we will be at war with China. The level of risk is high, and so I feel a sense of urgency to do something today to be ready for a battle that I'm promising you will happen 5 years from now. Well, you can't make those guarantees, right? So I think it has to seep into the public psyche. Members like Congressman Gallagher, making the case at a national stage level that these bad things do happen over which we have very little control over. We didn't prevent Russia from going into Ukraine. I don't know if we can prevent Iran from actually developing a nuclear inventory of weapons. And yet, once the bad thing happens, it's too late. And so I think it's just human experience, intelligence, and some wisdom that we know we have to be ready and we have to allocate some of the nation's treasury to that end.
And I'm encouraged at what I'm seeing among conservatives on Capitol Hill. They're understanding the threat of the Chinese Communist Party, and I think are seeing not just foreign policy, but domestic policy, trade policy, all in the context of the threat of Communist China. It's one of the 7 priority issues for the Heritage Foundation over the next 2 years as well, to confront the CCP. And so I'm encouraged that there's a growing awareness, and I think this is one element, one very important element, that we be prepared for. We know the most effective way to prepare and to have peace is to be prepared for war.
I know we have a few hundred people online.
Yes.
And Brent has been
okay.
questions,
All right,
so.
good. He's over here in my blind spot, so let's hear an online question.
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of online questions. I'm going to try my best to weave those that haven't already been addressed by Congressman Gallagher or already yourselves. There's several here that touch on posture question. And perhaps it's worthwhile maybe talking a little bit about that part of the index that talks about the threat by regions and where there may be the need for more presence or posture changes. Your thoughts on that? And to kind of cage the question a little bit, there was a concern about Ukraine, of course, and Europe. So what is this change or insights for our military posture in Europe? Maybe also the Middle East a little bit on that. A direct question from tapping off the congressman's comments about Taiwan, what needs to be in country there as well as proximate. And then another question about North Korean belligerency that's on the uptick. What needs to change in Japan and South Korea for U.S. military disposition that the index might be pointing to?
Well, we've got 250,000 words in the index that addresses all those. So I don't know that we're going to get into a lot of detail, but in general, the posture is not what it was in the past. So J.B. Venable, our colleague, Air Force career veteran, will often talk about that during the Cold War, the Air Force maintained 29 squadrons in Europe alone. Today, the active component of the Air Force has 32 total. So 32 across the Air Force active. In the old days, you would have 29, just applied to stationing in Europe. Today, the U.S. Army only has 2 brigades, a Stryker brigade or an infantry brigade, permanently based in Europe, a far cry from the level of U.S. presence, again, back in the Cold War. So there's rotational armor types of capabilities. The same thing, dramatic drawdown on the Korean Peninsula, minimal footprint in Japan, all things considered compared to the Cold War. So when the 90s occurred, we brought everybody back home, and we maintained essentially a token presence abroad in these other regions. 9/11 happens, now it's counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, primarily in Afghanistan and Iraq, and so we focused a lot of our operational presence there, but didn't really build up in any of these other locations in the world. So history has a way of coming back. Russia may be performing poorly, but look at the expenditure of munitions, the equipment, manpower, all the casualties and people that are pouring into that theater. So when we think about it from a U.S. presence perspective and our ability to support partners and allies, you just need more things forward postured. It takes 10 days to sail across the Atlantic. It takes 3 weeks to sail across the Pacific. And so again, that temporal, that time component, once a crisis occurs, it takes you months to prepare and to deploy and get there into place. So treaty obligations, looming threats, China's military expansionism, the stuff that Russia's doing, Syria, Iran, it just calls for a greater level of attention and investment of U.S. capabilities to buttress what our allies are also reinvesting in. And I'll just kind of leave it at that and direct folks to the index, I think, for more detailed discussions.
Well, that's a good place to end. We have run out of time, but we do have the index available. We also have, it's a great diagnosis and a description of where we are. We also have a series of recommendations that are available outside as well as to how to start to rebuild our military in a way that will make us be prepared to keep the peace. I want to thank everybody here, and thank you for those who are online who watched. And until next time, thank you.
Good evening from the Municipal Auditorium in Kansas City. I am Dorothy Ridings, the President of the League of Women Voters, the sponsor of this final presidential debate of the 1984 campaign between Republican Ronald Reagan and Democrat Walter Mondale. Our panelists for tonight's debate on defense and foreign policy issues are Georgie Ann Geyer, syndicated columnist for Universal Press Syndicate, Marvin Kalb, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent for NBC News, Morton Kondracki, Executive Editor of the New Republic magazine, and Henry Truitt, Diplomatic Correspondent for the Baltimore Sun. Edwin Newman, formerly of NBC News and now a syndicated columnist for King Features, is our moderator. Ed?
Dorothy Ridings, thank you. A brief word about our procedure tonight. The first question will go to Mr. Mondale. He'll have 2.5 minutes to reply. Then the panel member who put the question will ask a follow-up. The answer to that will be limited to 1 minute. After that, the same question will be put to President Reagan. Again, there will be a follow-up, and then each man will have 1 minute for rebuttal. The second question will go to President Reagan first. After that, the alternating will continue. At the end, there will be 4-minute summations with President Reagan going last. We have asked the questioners to be brief. Let's begin. Ms. Geyer, your question to Mr. Mondale.
Mr. Mondale, two related questions on the crucial issue of Central America. You and the Democratic Party have said that the only policy toward the horrendous civil wars in Central America should be on the economic development and negotiations, with perhaps a quarantine of Marxist Nicaragua. Do you believe that these answers would in any way solve the bitter conflicts there? Do you really believe that there is no need to resort to force at all? Are not these solutions to Central Americans' gnawing problems simply, again, too weak and too late?
I believe that the question oversimplifies the difficulties of what we must do in Central America. Our objectives ought to be to strengthen the democracies, to stop communist and other extremist influences, and stabilize the community in that area. To do that, we need a three-pronged attack. One is military assistance to our friends who are being pressured. Secondly, a strong and sophisticated economic aid program and human rights program that offers a better life and a sharper alternative to the alternative offered by the totalitarians who oppose us. And finally, a strong diplomatic effort that pursues the possibilities of peace in the area. That's one of the big disagreements that we have with the president, that they have not pursued the diplomatic opportunities, either within El Salvador or as between the countries, and have lost time during which we might have been able to achieve a peace. This brings up the whole question of what presidential leadership is all about. I think the lesson in Central America, this recent embarrassment in Nicaragua, where we are giving instructions for hired assassins, hiring criminals, and the rest, all of this has strengthened our opponents. A president must not only assure that we're tough, but we must also be wise and smart in the exercise of that power. We saw the same thing in Lebanon, where we spent a good deal of America's assets, but because the leadership of this government did not pursue wise policies, we have been humiliated and our opponents are stronger. The bottom line of national strength is that the president must be in command. He must lead. And when a president doesn't know that submarine missiles are recallable, says that 70% of our strategic forces are conventional, discovers 3 years into his administration that our arms control efforts have failed because he didn't know that most Soviet missiles were on land, these are things a president must know to command. A president is called the commander-in-chief, and he's called that because he's supposed to be in charge of the facts and run our government and strengthen our nation.
Mr. Mondale, if I could broaden the question just a little bit. Since World War II, every conflict that we as Americans have been involved with has been in non-conventional or irregular terms, and yet we keep fighting in conventional or traditional military terms. The Central American wars are very much in the same pattern as China, as Lebanon, as Iran, as Cuba in the early days. Do you see any possibility that we are going to realize the change in warfare in our time or react to it in those terms?
We absolutely must, which is why I responded to your first question the way I did. It's much more complex. You must understand the region. You must understand the politics of the area. You must provide a strong alternative, and you must show strength and all at the same time. That's why I object to the covert action in Nicaragua. That's a classic example of a strategy that's embarrassed us, strengthened our opposition, and undermined the moral authority of our people and our country in the region. Strength requires knowledge, command. We've seen in the Nicaraguan example a policy that has actually hurt us, strengthened our opposition, and undermined the moral authority of our country in that region.
Mr. President, in the last few months, it has seemed more and more that your policies in Central America were beginning to work. Yet just at this moment, we are confronted with the extraordinary story of a CIA guerrilla manual for the anti-Sandinista Contras, whom we are backing, which advocates not only assassinations of Sandinistas, but the hiring of criminals to assassinate the guerrillas we are supporting in order to create martyrs. Is this not, in effect, our own state-supported terrorism?
No, and I'm glad you asked that question because I know it's on many people's minds. I have ordered an investigation. I know that the CIA is already going forward with one. We have a gentleman down in Nicaragua who is on contract to the CIA advising supposedly on military tactics, the Contras. And he drew up this manual. It was turned over to the agency head of the CIA in Nicaragua to be printed. And a number of pages were excised by that agency head there, the man in charge. And he sent it on up here to CIA where more pages were excised before it was printed. But some way or other, there were 12 of the original copies that got out down there and were not submitted for this printing process by the CIA. Now, those are the details as we have them. And as soon as we have an investigation and find out where any blame lies for the few that did not get excised or changed, we certainly are going to do something about that. We'll take the proper action at the proper time. I was very interested to hear about Central America and our process down there, and I thought for a moment that instead of a debate, I was going to find Mr. Mondale in complete agreement with what we're doing, because the plan that he has outlined is the one we've been following for quite some time, including diplomatic processes throughout Central America and working closely with the Contadora group. So I can only tell you about the manual that we're not in the habit of assigning guilt before there has been proper evidence produced and proof of that guilt. But if guilt is established, whoever is guilty, we will treat with that situation then, and they will be removed.
Well, Mr. President, you are implying then that the CIA in Nicaragua is directing the Contras there. I'd also like to ask whether having the CIA investigate its own manual in such a sensitive area is not sort of like sending the fox into the chicken coop a second time.
I'm afraid I misspoke when I said a CIA head in Nicaragua. There's not someone there directing all of this activity. There are, as you know, CIA men stationed in other countries in the world and certainly in Central America. And so it was a man down there in that area that this was delivered to. And he recognized that what was in that manual was direct contravention of my own executive order in December of 1981, that we would have nothing to do with regard to political assassinations.
Mr. Mondale, your rebuttal.
What is a president charged with doing when he takes his oath of office? He raises his right hand and takes an oath of office to take care to faithfully execute the laws of the land. The president can't know everything, but a president has to know those things that are essential to his leadership and the enforcement of our laws. This manual, several thousands of which were produced, was distributed ordering political assassinations, hiring of criminals, and other forms of terrorism. Some of it was excised, but the part dealing with political terrorism was continued. How can this happen? How can something this serious occur in an administration and have a president of the United States in a situation like this say he didn't know? A president must know these things. I don't know which is worse, not knowing or knowing and not stopping it. And what about the mining of the harbors in Nicaragua, which violated international law? This has hurt this country, and a president's supposed to command.
Mr. President, your rebuttal.
Yes, I have so many things there to respond to. I'm going to pick out something you said earlier. You've been all over the country repeating something that I will admit the press has also been repeating, that I believed that nuclear missiles could be fired and then called back. I never ever conceived of such a thing. I never said any such thing. In a discussion of our strategic arms negotiations, I said that submarines carrying missiles and airplanes carrying missiles were more conventional type weapons, not as destabilizing as the land-based missiles, and that they were also weapons that, or carriers, that if they were sent out and there was a change, you could call them back before they had launched their missiles. But I hope that from here on, you will no longer be saying that particular thing, which is absolutely false. How anyone could think that any sane person would believe you could call back a nuclear missile, I think is as ridiculous as the whole concept has been. So thank you for giving me a chance to straighten the record. I'm sure that you'll appreciate that.
Mr. Kalb, Mr. Kalb, your question to President Reagan.
Mr. President, you have often described the Soviet Union as a powerful, evil empire intent on world domination, but this year you have said, and I quote, "If they want to keep their Mickey Mouse system, that's okay with me." Which is it, Mr. President? Do you want to contain them within their present borders and perhaps try to reestablish détente, or what goes for détente, or do you really want to roll back their empire?
I have said on a number of occasions exactly what I believe about the Soviet Union. I retract nothing that I have said. I believe that many of the things they have done are evil in any concept of morality that we have. But I also recognize that as the two great superpowers in the world, we have to live with each other. And I told Mr. Gromyko, we don't like their system, they don't like ours. And we're not going to change their system, and they sure better not try to change ours. But between us, we can either destroy the world or we can save it. And I suggested that certainly it was to their common interest, along with ours, to avoid a conflict and to attempt to save the world and remove the nuclear weapons. And I think that perhaps we established a little better understanding. I think that in dealing with the Soviet Union, one has to be realistic. I know that Mr. Mondale in the past has made statements as if they were just people like ourselves, and if we were kind and good and did something nice, they would respond accordingly. And the result was unilateral disarmament. We canceled the B-1 under the previous administration. What did we get for it? Nothing. The Soviet Union has been engaged in the biggest military buildup in the history of man. At the same time that we tried the policy of unilateral disarmament, of weakness, if you will. And now we are putting up a defense of our own, and I've made it very plain to them. We seek no superiority. We simply are going to provide a deterrent so that it will be too costly for them if they are nursing any ideas of aggression against us. Now, they claim they're not, and I made it plain to them, we're not. But there's been no change in my attitude at all. I just thought when I came into office it was time that there was some realistic talk to and about the Soviet Union. And we did get their attention.
Mr. President, perhaps the other side of the coin, a related question, sir. Since World War II, the vital interests of the United States have always been defined by treaty commitments and by presidential proclamations. Aside from what is obvious, such as NATO, for example, which countries, which regions in the world do you regard as vital national interests of this country, meaning that you would send American troops to fight there if they were in danger?
Well, now, you've added a hypothetical there at the end, Mr. Kelb, about that, where we would send troops in to fight. I am not going to make the decision as to what the tactics could be, but obviously there are a number of areas in the world that are of importance to us. One is the Middle East, and that is of interest to the whole Western world and the industrialized nations because of the great supply of energy upon which so many depend there. Our neighbors here in America are vital to us. We're working right now and trying to be of help in Southern Africa with regard to the independence of Namibia and the removal of the Cuban surrogates, the thousands of them, from Angola. So I can say there are a great many interests. I believe that we have a great interest in the Pacific Basin. That is where I think the future of the world lies. But I am not going to pick out one and in advance hypothetically say, oh yes, we would send troops there. I don't want to send troops
Mr. President.
anyplace.
Sorry, your time was up.
Mr. Mondale, you have described the Soviet leaders as, and I'm quoting, cynical, ruthless, and dangerous, suggesting an almost total lack of trust in them. In that case, what makes you think that the annual summit meetings with them that you've proposed will result in agreements that would satisfy the interests of this country?
Because the only type of agreements to reach with the Soviet Union are the types that are specifically defined so we know exactly what they must do, subject to full verification, which means we know every day whether they're living up to it, and follow-ups wherever we find suggestions that they're violating it, and the strongest possible terms. I have no illusions about the Soviet Union leadership or the nature of that state. They are a tough and a ruthless adversary, and we must be prepared to meet that challenge, and I would. Where I part with the President is that despite all of those differences, we must, as past presidents before this one have done, meet on the common ground of survival. And that's where the President has opposed practically every arms control agreement by every president of both political parties since the bomb went off. And he now completes this term with no progress toward arms control at all, but with a very dangerous arms race underway instead. There are now over 2,000 more warheads pointed at us today than there were when he was sworn in, and that does not strengthen us. We must be very, very realistic in the nature of that leadership, but we must grind away and talk to find ways to reducing these differences, particularly where arms races are concerned and other dangerous exercises of Soviet power. There will be no unilateral disarmament under my administration. I will keep this nation strong. I understand exactly what the Soviets are up to, but that too is a part of national strength. To do that, a president must know what is essential to command and to leadership and to strength. And that's where the president's failure to master, in my opinion, the essential elements of arms control has cost us dearly. These 4 years, 3 years into this administration, he said he just discovered that most Soviet missiles are on land, and that's why his proposal didn't work. I invite the American people tomorrow, because I will issue the statement, quoting President Reagan. He said exactly what I said he said. He said that these missiles were less dangerous than ballistic missiles because you could fire them and you could recall them if you decided there had been a miscalculation.
I'm sorry,
a president must know those things.
Related question, Mr. Mondale, on Eastern Europe. Do you accept the conventional diplomatic wisdom that Eastern Europe is a Soviet sphere of influence? And if you do, what could a Mondale administration realistically do to help the people of Eastern Europe achieve the human rights that were guaranteed to them as a result of the Helsinki Accords?
I think the essential strategy of the United States ought not accept any Soviet control over Eastern Europe. We ought to deal with each of these countries separately. We ought to pursue strategies with each of them, economic and the rest, that help them pull away from their dependence upon the Soviet Union. Where the Soviet Union has acted irresponsibly, as they have in many of those countries, especially recently in Poland, I believe we ought to insist that Western credits extended to the Soviet Union bear the market rate, make the Soviets pay for their irresponsibility. That is a very important objective, to make certain that we continue to look forward to progress toward greater independence by these nations and work with each of them separately.
Mr. President, your rebuttal.
Yes, I'm not going to continue trying to respond to these repetitions of the falsehoods that have already been stated here. But with regard to whether Mr. Mondale would be strong as he said he would be, I know that he has a commercial out where he is appearing on the deck of the Nimitz and watching the F-14s take off, and that's an image of strength. Except that if he had had his way when the Nimitz was being planned, he would have been deep in the water out there because there wouldn't have been any Nimitz to stand on. He was against it. He was against the F-14 fighter. He was against the M1 tank. He was against the B-1 bomber. He wanted to cut the salary of all of the military. He wanted to bring home half of the American forces in Europe. And he has a record of weakness with regard to our national defense that is second to none. Indeed, he was on that side virtually throughout all his years in the Senate, and he opposed even President Carter when, toward the end of his term, President Carter wanted to increase the defense budget.
Mr. Mondale, your rebuttal.
Mr. President, I accept your commitment to peace, but I want you to accept my commitment to a strong national defense. I have proposed a budget which would increase our nation's strength in real terms by double that of the Soviet Union. I'll tell you where we disagree. It is true, over 10 years ago, I voted to delay production of the F-14, and I'll tell you why. The plane wasn't flying the way it was supposed to be. It was a waste of money. Your definition of national strength is to throw money at the Defense Department. My definition of national strength is to make certain that a dollar spent buys us a dollar's worth of defense. There's a big difference between the two of us. A president must manage that budget. I will keep us strong, but you'll not do that unless you command that budget and make certain we get the strength that we need. When you pay $500 for a $5 hammer, you're not buying strength.
I would ask the audience not to applaud. All it does is take up time that we would like to devote to the debate. Mr. Kondracki, a question to Mr. Mondale.
Mr. Mondale, in an address earlier this year, you said that before this country resorts to military force, and I'm quoting, American interests should be sharply defined, publicly supported, congressionally sanctioned, militarily feasible, internationally defensible, open to independent scrutiny, and alert to regional history. Now, aren't you setting up such a gauntlet of tests here that adversaries could easily suspect that as president you would never use force to protect American interests?
No, as a matter of fact, I believe every one of those standards is essential to the exercise of power by this country. And we can see that in both Lebanon and in Central America. In Lebanon, this president exercised American power all right, but the management of it was such that our Marines were killed. We had to leave in humiliation. The Soviet Union became stronger, terrorists became emboldened, and it was because they did not think through how power should be exercised, did not have the American public with them on a plan that worked, that we ended up the way we did. Similarly, in Central America, what we're doing in Nicaragua with this covert war, which the Congress, including many Republicans, have tried to stop, is finally end up with a public definition of American power that hurts us, where we get associated with political assassins and the rest. We have to decline for the first time in modern history jurisdiction of the World Court because they'll find us guilty of illegal actions, and our enemies are strengthened from all of this. We need to be strong. We need to be prepared to use that strength, but we must understand that we are a democracy. We are a government by the people, and when we move, it should be for very severe and extreme reasons that serve our national interest and end up with a stronger country behind us. It is only in that way that we can persevere.
You've been quoted as saying that you might quarantine Nicaragua. I'd like to know what that means. Would you stop Soviet ships as President Kennedy did in 1962, and wouldn't that be more dangerous than President Reagan's covert war?
What I'm referring to there is the mutual self-defense provisions that exist in the Inter-American Treaty, so-called Rio Pact, that permits the nations, our friends in that region, to combine to take steps, diplomatic and otherwise, to prevent Nicaragua, when she acts irresponsibly in asserting power in other parts outside of her border, to take those steps, whatever they might be, to stop it. The Nicaraguans must know that it is the policy of our government that those people, that leadership must stay behind the boundaries of their nation, not interfere in other nations. And by working with all of the nations in the region, unlike the policies of this administration, and unlike the President said they have not supported negotiations in that region, we will be much stronger because we'll have the moral authority that goes with those efforts.
President Reagan, you introduced U.S. forces into Lebanon as neutral peacekeepers, but then you made them combatants on the side of the Lebanese government. Eventually, you were forced to withdraw them under fire, and now Syria, a Soviet ally, is dominant in the country. Doesn't Lebanon represent a major failure on the part of your administration and raise serious questions about your capacity as a foreign policy strategist and as commander-in-chief?
No, Morton, I don't agree to all of those things. First of all, when we and our allies, the Italians, the French, and the United Kingdom went into Lebanon, we went in there at the request of what was left of the Lebanese government to be a stabilizing force while they tried to establish a government. But the first time we went in at their request because the war was going on right in Beirut between Israel and the PLO terrorists. Israel could not be blamed for that. Those terrorists had been violating their northern border consistently, and Israel chased them all the way to there. Then we went in with a multinational force to help remove, and did remove, more than 13,000 of those terrorists from Lebanon. We departed, and then the government of Lebanon asked us back in as a stabilizing force while they established a government and sought to get the foreign forces all the way out of Lebanon, and that they could then take care of their own borders. And we were succeeding. We were there for the better part of a year. Our position happened to be at the airport. Oh, there were occasional snipings and sometimes some artillery fire. But we did not engage in conflict that was out of line with our mission. I will never send troops anywhere on a mission of that kind without telling them that if somebody shoots at them, they can darn well shoot back. And this is what we did. We never initiated any kind of action. We defended ourselves there. But we were succeeding to the point that the Lebanese government had been organized. If you will remember, there were the meetings in Geneva in which they began to meet with the hostile factional forces and try to put together some kind of a peace plan. We were succeeding, and that was why the terrorist acts began. There are forces there, and that includes Syria in my mind, who don't want us to succeed, who don't want that kind of a peace with a dominant Lebanon dominant over its own territory. And so the terrorist acts began and led to the one great tragedy when they were killed in that suicide bombing of the building. Then the multilateral force withdrew for only one reason. We withdrew because we were no longer able to carry out the mission for which we had been sent in. But we went in the interest of peace and to keep Israel and Syria from getting into the sixth war between them. And I have no apologies for our going on a peace mission.
Mr. President, 4 years ago, you criticized President Carter for ignoring ample warnings that our diplomats in Iran might be taken hostage. Haven't you done exactly the same thing in Lebanon, not once, but 3 times, with 300 Americans not hostages but dead? And you vowed swift retaliation against terrorists, but doesn't our lack of response suggest that you're just bluffing?
Morton, no. I think there's a great